You don't need to do anything. Just listen and let go. The butler adjusted his cufflinks and cleared his throat before speaking. The young master once asked me why I always carry a handkerchief, he said, smoothing the fabric of his gloves. Mrs. Harrington nodded from her chair by the fireplace. She folded her hands in her lap and waited for him to continue. I told him it was simply proper, the butler said. He paused to pour tea into her cup without making a sound. The steam curled upwards as she lifted the cup. And was that the truth? She asked after a sip. He hesitated for a moment before answering. Not entirely. Mrs. Harrington set her cup down on the saucer. I thought not. The butler straightened his posture slightly. The truth is, I've found it useful over the years for unexpected spills or when someone might need it. She watched him closely. That sounds more like you. He glanced at his gloves again. Young Master William pressed further, of course. Children always do. Mrs. Harrington smiled briefly. They do. What did you tell him then? I said handkerchiefs are like secrets, the butler replied. Better to have one ready than be caught without. She considered this. And did he understand? I believe he did, the butler said. He stopped asking after that. Mrs. Harrington took another sip of tea. Did he ever see you use it? Once, the butler admitted, when he scraped his knee in the garden. She nodded slowly. And what happened then? He didn't say anything, just watched me fold it back into my pocket afterward. The butler adjusted his gloves again. Sometimes actions mean more than explanations. Mrs. Harrington tapped her fingers against the cup. He hasn't asked about handkerchiefs since. Not directly. The butler glanced toward the garden doors. But last week, I noticed he'd tucked one into his own pocket before going out. She raised an eyebrow. You're teaching him more than you realize. The butler shook his head slightly. Children learn what they choose to learn. Mrs. Harrington put her cup down harder than usual. Does he know his father never carries one? The butler's hands paused midair. I wouldn't presume to say. She leaned forward slightly. Tell me honestly, did you suggest he start carrying it? The butler met her eyes properly for the first time. I wouldn't interfere like that. Mrs. Harrington exhaled slowly through her nose. But you're pleased he started carrying one. I'm pleased he noticed something worth carrying. The butler moved the teapot slightly to the left on the tray. She watched his hands. Do you think he'll keep doing it? That depends, he said, on whether he finds his own reasons. Mrs. Harrington leaned back slightly. You don't think it's just imitation? The butler shook his head. Children imitate until they understand. Then they choose. She glanced at the garden doors again. I saw him wipe his nose with it yesterday. He'll learn proper use, the butler said, or he'll learn his own way. Mrs. Harrington picked up her cup again, but didn't drink. His father would laugh if he saw. The butler didn't answer right away. He watched the steam rise from the teapot for a moment. People laugh at what they don't understand. She set the cup down harder than she meant to. Do you think I don't understand? He met her eyes again. I think you understand more than most. Mrs. Harrington exhaled sharply. Then, why does it feel like we're talking in circles? The butler hesitated before speaking. Perhaps because we're not discussing handkerchiefs anymore. She looked down at her hands. No, I suppose we're not. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the faint ticking of the mantel clock. Mrs. Harrington rubbed her thumb along the edge of the saucer. Do you think he'll ask about it again? The butler refilled her teacup halfway before answering. He might. Children circle back to things. She watched the tea swirl in her cup. What will you tell him next time? That depends on what he asks. The butler folded his hands behind his back. Children's questions change as they grow. Mrs. Harrington traced the rim of her cup with one finger. You're right about circling back. He asked me yesterday why you polish the silver yourself. The butler's eyebrows lifted slightly. And what did you say? I said some things are worth doing with your own hands. She looked up at him. Was that wrong? The butler shook his head. No, that's accurate. Mrs. Harrington rubbed her temple lightly. He asked if his father ever polished silver. And I told him no. She paused. I didn't say why. The butler nodded slowly. Children notice differences before they understand them. Mrs. Harrington ran a finger along the teacup handle. He's noticing more than differences lately. He's noticing absences. The butler studied the pattern in the rug. Absences leave more questions than differences do. She set down her cup with deliberate care. He asked me yesterday where his father keeps his handkerchiefs. The butler's hands remained still behind his back. And what did you say? Mrs. Harrington let out a slow breath. I told him his father keeps them in his dresser drawer, which isn't a lie, but not the whole truth, the butler said quietly. She pressed her lips together. No, I didn't mention that the drawer has been empty for years. The butler watched her fingers tighten around the teacup handle. He'll notice that soon enough on his own. Mrs. Harrington blinked rapidly. He's already going through the drawers. Last week, he took one of his father's old ties. The butler inhaled slowly. Did he wear it? She shook her head. He folded it under his pillow. I found it when changing the sheets. Children hold onto things, the butler said. Sometimes literally. Mrs. Harrington's voice dropped lower. He asked me yesterday when his father is coming home. The butler let out a slow breath. That's a harder question. She twisted her wedding ring around her finger. I told him I didn't know. The butler nodded. That was honest. Mrs. Harrington looked at her empty cup. He didn't like that answer. The butler poured more tea without being asked. Children rarely do. She sighed. He asked if his father still loved him. The butler's hands paused for just a second before continuing to pour. And what did you say? Mrs. Harrington pressed her fingertips against her lips. I told him, of course, his father loves him. that some people show love differently. He set the teapot down carefully. That was a good answer. She shook her head slowly. He said that wasn't an answer at all. He wanted to know why his father doesn't come home if he loves him. The butler folded his hands together. Children ask questions they already know the answers to sometimes. Mrs. Harrington exhaled shakily. He's not a child anymore. He's 12. That's still a child, the butler said. Just one who sees more than he should. She rubbed her thumb along her wedding band. He asked if his father left because of him. The butler leaned forward slightly. And what did you say? Mrs. Harrington looked at her hands. I told him no, that his father's choices had nothing to do with him. The butler nodded. That was right. She swallowed hard. He asked if his father would come back if he was better. The butler looked at her for a long moment. 12 is old enough to know better, but not old enough to stop hopping. Mrs. Harrington pressed her palms flat against the table. I don't know what to say to him anymore. You said the right thing. The butler smoothed his gloves. He'll ask again when he's ready to hear something different. She turned her wedding ring around her finger. What if he's never ready? The butler poured more tea. Then he'll stop asking. Mrs. Harrington rubbed her temples. He shouldn't have to figure this out alone. The butler set the teapot down gently. He's not alone. She looked up sharply. But he feels alone. That's worse. The butler adjusted his gloves again. Give him time. Mrs. Harrington pressed her fingers against her forehead. How much time? He'll let you know, the butler said, by what he asks. She looked down at her hands. I don't think I can answer his next question. The butler poured the last of the tea. Then don't. Just listen. Mrs. Harrington picked up her cup, but didn't drink. What if he asks why his father never writes? He might. The butler wiped a drop from the teapot spout with his thumb. You'll know what to say when he does. She set the cup down without sipping. I doubt that. The butler folded his napkin in half. You'll surprise yourself. Mrs. Harrington twisted her wedding band again. What if I say the wrong thing? Say what's true, the butler said, not what's kind. She exhaled slowly, even if it hurts him. The butler smoothed his gloves one last time. Better honest pain than comforting lies. Mrs. Harrington pressed her lips together until they turned pale. He's just a boy. He's stronger than you think, the butler said. He watched her hands tremble around the teacup. She swallowed hard enough for him to hear it. What if I'm not strong enough? The butler didn't answer right away. He turned the empty teapot slightly on the tray before speaking. You won't be alone when he asks. Mrs. Harrington rubbed her thumb over her wedding band. You'll be there. If you want me to be, he said. He adjusted his gloves again. But I think you'll find the words. She exhaled shakily. What if he asks where his father is? The butler folded his hands together. Then you'll tell him whatever you think he's ready to hear. Mrs. Harrington pressed her lips together. And if I don't know what that is, you'll know, the butler said, when the time comes. Mrs. Harrington twisted her wedding ring again. What if the time is now? The butler glanced toward the hallway where William's footsteps could be heard approaching. Then we'll know soon enough. She pressed her palms flat against the tabletop. He's coming. The butler adjusted his gloves one final time. Yes, he is. Mrs. Harrington smoothed her skirt with both hands. Do I look all right? You always do. The butler stepped back slightly from the table. William appeared in the doorway, his shoes scuffing against the hardwood floor. He held a crumpled handkerchief in one hand. Mrs. Harrington forced a smile. There you are. Her fingers tapped against her teacup. William stood still, looking between them. The handkerchief dangled from his fingers, stained with dirt around the edges. The butler straightened his tie. Good afternoon, young master. William didn't respond. He twisted the handkerchief in his hands, the fabric making soft, rustling sounds. Mrs. Harrington inhaled sharply through her nose. What's wrong? Her voice came out tighter than she intended. William twisted the handkerchief tighter, staring at a loose thread near the hem. I found this in Father's desk. The butler cleared his throat softly. Were you looking for something specific, young master? William shook his head fast, his shoulders hunching slightly. Just looking. Mrs. Harrington reached out halfway before letting her hand drop back to her lap. Did you find anything else? William's grip on the handkerchief tightened. He shook his head again, but slower this time. The butler took a small step forward. That handkerchief looks like it needs washing, young master. Shall I take care of it? William looked down at the wrinkled fabric. It's got writing on it. His voice cracked slightly. Mrs. Harrington's teacup clinked against the saucer as she set it down too quickly. Writing. William unfolded the handkerchief carefully, revealing faded ink along one edge. It's hard to read. The butler stepped closer without touching it. May I see, young master? William hesitated before holding it out. The fabric trembled slightly in his fingers. Mrs. Harrington pressed her lips together. Her hands stayed folded in her lap, knuckles whitening. The butler took the handkerchief carefully, holding it by the edges. He turned it toward the window light without blocking William's view. William's shoulders tensed as he watched the butler's hands. His breath came faster now, uneven. Mrs. Harrington moved her cup aside silently. Her fingers left damp prints on the saucer. The butler smoothed the fabric flat against his gloved palm. The ink had bled into the fibers, but the numbers were still legible. William shifted his weight from one foot to the other. It's a date, isn't it? His voice wavered between curiosity and dread. Mrs. Harrington reached for the handkerchief, but stopped midway. She curled her fingers back into her palm. The butler turned the cloth slightly. April 12th, he said quietly. 5 years ago. William blinked fast. That's my birthday, he said. His fingers twitched toward the handkerchief, but didn't take it. Mrs. Harrington stood up suddenly, her chair scraping against the floor. She didn't say anything. The butler folded the handkerchief neatly along its original creases. "Your father must have forgotten it there," he said. William stared at the folded square. "He forgot a lot of things," he said softly. Mrs. Harrington's fingers twitched toward her wedding ring, but didn't touch it. The butler offered the handkerchief back. "Would you like me to clean this for you, young master?" William took it slowly, unfolding one corner to look at the date again. Mrs. Harrington cleared her throat. "It's just an old handkerchief," she said. Her voice sounded strained. William rubbed his thumb over the faded ink. Why would he write my birthday on it? The butler straightened his jacket sleeves. People mark things in odd ways sometimes. William folded the handkerchief into smaller and smaller squares. "Did he write other dates too?" he asked without looking up. Mrs. Harrington reached for her teacup again, but didn't lift it. Her fingers tapped against the china. The butler watched William's hands fold the handkerchief methodically. "That's the only one I've seen, young master." William pressed the folded square against his palm. "Did he carry it with him?" Mrs. Harrington's cup rattled against the saucer as she set it down. The butler glanced at her before answering. "He may have at one time." William turned the handkerchief over in his hands. Was it important to him? Mrs. Harrington's fingers tightened around the chair back. She didn't speak. The butler adjusted his gloves. "Important enough to write on, young master." William traced the numbers with his fingertip. "Then, why did he leave it behind?" His voice cracked on the last word. Mrs. Harrington reached out, but stopped herself halfway. She gripped the edge of the table instead. The butler smoothed his gloves against his palms. "Some things get misplaced over time, young master." William folded the handkerchief back into its smallest possible square. "Not things that matter," he said quietly. Mrs. Harrington exhaled sharply through her nose. Her knuckles whitened against the table edge. The butler cleared his throat softly. "People misplace important things every day, young master. That doesn't make them matter less." William tucked the folded handkerchief into his shirt pocket carefully, patting it twice, like sealing an envelope. His fingers lingered over the small bulge it made. Mrs. Harrington watched the motion with an odd expression, part longing, part relief, as if seeing something familiar in the gesture. She opened her mouth, then closed it when William looked up abruptly. The butler shifted his weight almost imperceptibly, his polished shoes making no sound on the hardwood. "Would you care for some tea, young master?" he asked, gesturing to the still warm pot. Mrs. Harrington let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding as William turned toward the tea service. His fingers, still resting on the handkerchief in his pocket, twitched once before withdrawing. "I found something else," William said abruptly, reaching into his trouser pocket with his free hand. The silver cufflink he produced caught the afternoon light, winking like a conspirator. The butler's gloves made a soft creaking sound as his hands flexed involuntarily. Mrs. Harrington made a small noise in her throat, not quite a gasp, not quite a sigh, as she recognized the monogrammed initials. William turned the cufflink slowly between thumb and forefinger, watching the light play across its surface. "It was in the same drawer," he said quietly, "behind the handkerchief." His eyes lifted to meet his mother's. Why would he leave these things behind? Mrs. Harrington's fingers fluttered to her throat, where a matching silver brooch nestled against her collar. The silence stretched taut between them, broken only by the faint ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. The butler cleared his throat delicately. "Some things aren't meant to travel, young master." His gloved hand hovered near the teapot, as if unsure whether to pour or retreat. William pressed the cufflink into his palm until the monogram left tiny indentations in his skin. His voice, when it came, was barely above a whisper. "But people are." Mrs. Harrington's fingers tightened around the brooch at her throat, as if it burned. The butler watched her knuckles turn pale against the silver, then deliberately turned to adjust the teapot's position on the tray, giving her a moment to compose herself. William unfolded his hand and stared at the cufflink, now warm from his grip. Did he mean to come back for them? The question hung between them like the steam from the cooling tea. The butler smoothed a wrinkle from his glove before answering. "Some departures," he said carefully, "are meant to be temporary." Mrs. Harrington's sharp intake of breath filled the pause before he added, "Until they're not." William turned the cufflink over again, watching the light catch the engraved date beneath the initials, the same date as the handkerchief. His thumb traced the numbers blindly, as if reading Braille. Mrs. Harrington reached out with trembling fingers, stopping just short of touching the silver in her son's hand. "That was our wedding anniversary," she whispered. The admission hovered in the air like dust motes caught in sunlight. The grandfather clock ticked 3 times before William closed his fingers around the cufflink again, pressing it against the handkerchief in his pocket, until both left matching impressions against his ribs. Mrs. Harrington's hand remained suspended in midair, her wedding band catching the light as it trembled, not quite reaching, not quite withdrawing, while the scent of bergamot from the cooling tea curled between them like unanswered questions. The butler watched a single drop of condensation slide down the teapot spout, timing his next words to land between clock ticks. "Shall I freshen the pot, madam?" His gloves made no sound against the porcelain handle. William finally looked up from his pocket, his eyes flickering between his mother's frozen gesture and the butler's poised teapot. "No," he said quietly, pressing his palm flat against the hidden objects. "I think it's already steeped long enough." Mrs. Harrington's hand slowly lowered to rest on the tablecloth, fingers curling around a loose thread in the lace. The brooch at her collar had twisted slightly askew, its sharp point catching the light at an odd angle. The butler set the teapot down with exaggerated care, aligning it precisely with the tray's engraved pattern. His gloves made a soft, shushing sound against the silver as he adjusted the angle by millimeters. William took a sudden step forward, the movement making his shadow stretch across the tea service. "Do you still have yours?" he asked abruptly, looking at his mother's throat where the brooch gleamed. His voice held a strange mixture of challenge and hope. Mrs. Harrington's fingers twitched toward the brooch again, then stilled. The clock ticked twice before she answered in a voice barely louder than the settling tea leaves. "Some things," she said, "aren't meant to be put away." William's eyes flickered to the butler's gloves, always pristine, always hiding whatever marks might lie beneath. The silence stretched until the butler cleared his throat softly and adjusted a sugar tong by millimeters. The brooch caught the dying light as Mrs. Harrington turned her head slightly, revealing the engraving on its back, the same date, the same initials, mirrored like a promise. William's breath hitched when he saw it. Down the hall, a door clicked shut, perhaps the wind, perhaps something else, making all three of them turn toward the sound with identical, startled motions. The teapot sighed steam into the sudden stillness. William's fingers flexed around the hidden objects in his pocket, his thumb finding the raised edges of his father's engraved initials through the fabric. The brooch at his mother's throat winked in the fading light, as if sharing a secret he wasn't meant to understand yet. The butler's gloved hands hovered near the tray, frozen in mid-adjustment, as a beam of late afternoon sunlight illuminated the dust swirling between them, each speck holding the unspoken weight of that engraved date, that abandoned handkerchief, that lingering question neither mother nor son dared voice aloud. Mrs. Harrington's lips parted as if to speak, but no words came, only the quietest exhale that stirred the stray curl fallen across her brow. The same stubborn wave her son had inherited, and his father had always ruffled affectionately. William withdrew his hand from his pocket, the cufflink glinting between his fingers, its chain dangling like an unfinished thought. He studied the way the silver caught the light, not accusingly, but with the quiet intensity of someone assembling puzzle pieces that refused to fit. The butler reached for the teapot with deliberate slowness, the porcelain clinking softly against his gloves as he poured a fresh cup, too late now for warmth. The steam already dissipated, and set it precisely before Mrs. Harrington's untouched saucer. His eyes flickered to William's fist, clenched around silver and linen both. Somewhere beyond the garden doors, a branch tapped against the window pane in a rhythm that might have been Morse code, or merely the wind, three quick, too slow, as William finally lifted his gaze to meet his mother's. The shared knowledge of that engraved date hovering between them like the ghost of a hand, not quite reaching across the table. The butler poured himself a cup of cold tea with deliberate ceremony, the amber liquid swirling in the cup, as if to mimic the way William's fingers now twisted the cufflink's chain into intricate knots, the silver flashing like semaphore signals in the dimming light. Mrs. Harrington's brooch caught on a loose thread of her collar when she inhaled sharply, the tiny tear sounding louder than the grandfather clock's next tick, as William abruptly stilled his fidgeting, both frozen in the aftermath of that small, revealing sound. Down the hall, the door creaked open again, definitely not the wind this time, and all three heads turned toward the sound with varying degrees of hope and dread, the abandoned tea growing colder by the second as footsteps echoed on the hardwood, neither slow enough for a servant nor quick enough for a guest. Mrs. Harrington's brooch snagged another thread as she straightened abruptly, her fingers hovering near the clasp as if torn between removing it and pressing it closer to her skin, while William's fist tightened around the cufflink until its edges bit into his palm, leaving tiny crescent moons that matched the ones beneath his mother's eyes. The butler set down his untouched cup with deliberate precision, his gloves making no sound against the saucer, as his eyes flickered to the hallway where the footsteps paused just beyond sight, long enough for Mrs. Harrington's breath to catch, for William's shoulders to tense, before continuing at that same uneven pace, neither rushing nor delaying the inevitable revelation. When the shadow finally fell across the doorway, it was neither as tall as memory had painted nor as unfamiliar as fear had imagined, and the suitcase that thudded against the floorboards held the weight of 5 years' worth of unwritten letters in its scuffed leather and broken latch. Mrs. Harrington's fingers released the brooch just as William's fist unclenched, the cufflink rolling onto the tablecloth with a quiet clatter that sounded impossibly loud in the stillness, its engraved date catching the light like an accusation or an apology, depending on who was looking. The butler took 3 silent steps backward, his gloves brushing the teapot's cold surface as he deliberately positioned himself equidistant between mother and son, not protecting, not interfering, merely witnessing as the dropped handkerchief drifted slowly to the floor between them, its embroidered numbers facing upward like a question nobody had dared answer aloud. Somewhere beyond the garden doors, the tapping branch fell still, as if even the wind was holding its breath to see whether hands would reach across the space where years and teacups and half-spoken truths had piled up like unopened mail on a hallway table. Mrs. Harrington's brooch swung slightly as she turned her head, not fully toward the doorway, not fully away, the motion making the engraved date flash once before hiding again against her collar. Like a secret she couldn't decide whether to keep or surrender. William's fingers twitched toward the fallen handkerchief, but didn't lift it, his shadow stretching just far enough to touch the edge of the suitcase, where a custom sticker peeled away in one corner, revealing a departure city that matched none of the excuses they'd been given. The butler adjusted his gloves soundlessly, his polished shoes pivoting precisely 15 degrees toward the hallway. Not enough to block the view, just enough to catch the first words before they reached the table where the cold tea and colder silences waited. Mrs. Harrington's brooch chain snapped suddenly, the sound like a watch spring breaking, as the shadow in the doorway shifted weight from left foot to right in that familiar, uneven rhythm that used to mean tiredness after long travels, but now just meant absence had changed him too. William's outstretched fingers froze midway to the fallen handkerchief when the suitcase creaked open of its own accord, revealing neatly folded shirts with cufflink slots still empty after all these years, except for one where a single monogrammed W caught the light, slightly tarnished at the edges from being handled too often by uncertain hands. The grandfather clock chose that moment to strike the half hour, its chimes slicing through the dust motes, swirling in the slanted sunlight, as the butler's glove brushed the teapot's cold curve, not pouring, not serving, just anchoring himself to something solid in a room where even the air tasted like turned pages in a long unopened book. Mrs. Harrington's brooch clattered onto the saucer beside her untouched tea, its broken chain coiling like a silver question mark as her hands fluttered up, not quite reaching toward the doorway, not quite pressing against her throat, while her son's abandoned cufflink rolled to rest against the teapot's base. The engraved date now tilted toward the light at the exact angle it had been 5 years ago, when slipped into a pocket for just until morning. William's shadow merged with the silhouette in the doorway as he took one involuntary step forward, his untucked shirt revealing the edge of his father's stolen tie still tucked into his waistband, the silk now creased from being slept on, the pattern blurred by pillowcase friction and half-remembered bedtime stories. The butler exhaled through his nose, a sound precisely calculated to match the grandfather clock's pendulum swing, as the suitcase finally settled with a sigh of leather and lost time, its contents whispering secrets in starch and cedar that made both mother and son inhale sharply in unison, their postures mirroring each other's tension like bookends, holding up different chapters of the same story. Mrs. Harrington's broken brooch chain slithered into her teacup with a soft splash, the silver tangling with bergamot leaves in a way that made William flinch, as if witnessing something private his father's, uneven footsteps crossing the threshold, sounding less like arrival and more like punctuation, marks inserted halfway through an unfinished sentence. The butler's gloved fingers tightened imperceptibly around the teapot handle when the newcomer's shadow stretched across the fallen handkerchief, not obscuring the embroidered date, but aligning with it at an angle that made the numbers appear freshly inked for a single suspended moment before the light shifted again. William's stolen tie slipped further from his waistband as he rocked forward onto the balls of his feet, caught between childhood's instinct to run toward, and adolescence urged to stand still, while his mother's hands remained frozen above her ruined brooch, her wedding band gleaming dully against skin gone pale from clutching too many unanswered letters. The suitcase released the faint scent of lavender and railway stations. When its owner crouched to pick up the fallen handkerchief, his fingers hesitating over the embroidered numbers in a way that suggested he'd forgotten his own handiwork. Before pressing the fabric to his nose, in a gesture so instinctively paternal that William's breath hitched audibly, Mrs. Harrington's teacup trembled when the brooch chain slithered against porcelain, the sound drawing her husband's gaze upward, past the butler's motionless gloves, past his son's grass-stained knees, to meet eyes that held neither accusation nor forgiveness, just the quiet exhaustion of someone who'd packed too many apologies into a single suitcase. The butler allowed himself one nearly imperceptible nod, more a settling of his collar than any real movement, as William's fingers finally closed around his father's outstretched wrist, not shaking it so much as confirming its solidity, while the grandfather clock's pendulum swung through another arc, measuring this new silence in different increments than the old ones. Mrs. Harrington's brooch sank slowly into the teacup's dregs, the engraved date disappearing beneath the surface like a ship's name slipping underwater, though her hands remained suspended above the saucer, fingers curled, as if still holding the weight of all those years' worth of unspoken questions she couldn't decide whether to voice now, or let dissolve like sugar in cold tea. The returned traveler's cufflinks, one still tucked in William's pocket, the other pressing a small indentation into his palm, where he'd clenched it too tightly, caught the fading light at mismatched angles, casting twin reflections across the ceiling that almost, but didn't quite meet, while the butler's gloves remained perfectly still against the teapot's curve. His presence, now more punctuation mark than participant in this scene, unfolding between the abandoned handkerchief and the half-open suitcase. William's stolen tie finally slipped free entirely, pooling at his feet in a silken puddle that might have been surrender or invitation, as his father's fingers, still holding the handkerchief, twitched toward it with a hesitation that spoke of recognizing something once given away now returned in altered form. While beyond the garden doors, the branch resumed its tapping, this time in a rhythm that almost sounded like someone counting years backward toward an apology. The butler's glove made its first audible sound of the afternoon, a faint creak of leather as his fingers flexed around the teapot handle. When Mrs. Harrington's wedding band struck the saucer with a dull chime, her hand now palm up on the tablecloth in a gesture that could have been asking or offering, her broken brooch chain dangling between her fingers like a question half answered. The suitcase exhaled another breath of lavender and train platforms when its owner shifted weight onto his bad knee. The old injury William only knew from whispered kitchen staff stories, making him list slightly sideways, until his shadow merged with his son's on the wallpaper in a silhouette that looked, for one disorienting moment, like the boy William had been 5 years earlier, clinging to a trouser leg at the front door. Down the hall, the grandfather clock's weights clicked as they settled into a new position, its pendulum now swinging through air still thick with the ghosts of unpacked suitcases and unasked questions, while the butler, calculating the exact moment when his presence would shift from witness to intrusion, allowed himself one nearly imperceptible backward step toward the service door, his polished shoes making no sound on the hardwood as the family's 3 separate silences began, tentatively, to braid themselves into something that might eventually resemble conversation. William's fingers, still gripping his father's wrist, relaxed just enough for the man's pulse to become detectable beneath the skin, a rhythm neither fast nor slow, but startlingly present after so many years of imagining it in foreign train compartments or unfamiliar hotel rooms, while Mrs. Harrington's upturned palm remained perfectly still on the tablecloth, her wedding band catching the dying light at an angle that made it impossible to tell whether it was being offered or merely displayed for inspection. The handkerchief, now transferred from father to son in a motion that might have been surrender or inheritance, fluttered briefly before settling into William's pocket alongside its mate, one marked with his birthday, the other with his parents' wedding anniversary, their embroidered dates pressed together beneath the fabric like complementary halves of a story neither had ever heard the ending of, while the butler's shadow, retreating toward the hallway, elongated just enough to briefly touch the suitcase's broken latch before withdrawing completely. Somewhere beyond the garden doors, the branch finally stilled as the wind shifted direction, carrying with it the faint scent of rain that hadn't yet fallen, while inside, the teapot, now cold beneath the butler's abandoned glove, condensed a single drop of moisture that rolled slowly down its curve to land precisely where Mrs. Harrington's brooch chain had lain moments before, the liquid spreading across the saucer in a pattern that almost resembled an unfinished letter W. William exhaled shakily through his nose, a sound that mirrored his father's habitual sigh so exactly it made both adults blink, before reaching into his pocket with his free hand to produce the second handkerchief, its folded edges revealing just enough of the embroidered date to make his father's grip tighten imperceptibly around his wrist, the pressure neither painful nor restraining, but grounding in a way that suggested neither had expected this particular collision of past and present. The suitcase, sensing the shift in attention, seemed to exhale another breath of travel-worn leather and lavender sachets, its contents settling with a whisper that drew Mrs. Harrington's gaze downward to where her husband's spare cufflinks, the mates to the one still pressed into her son's palm, gleamed dully against a stack of unworn shirts, their polished surfaces scratched from years of being carried, but never used, like promises too fragile to risk breaking. Down the hall, the grandfather clock's weights clicked again, as if marking this moment differently than all the others, its pendulum swinging through an arc that sent shadows shifting across the wallpaper, where father and son's merged silhouette now trembled slightly at the edges, not quite dissolving, not quite solidifying, while the butler's retreating footsteps faded into the house's deeper silence, leaving behind only the faintest indentation in the carpet where he'd stood guard for so many years between what was said and what was meant. Mrs. Harrington's fingers twitched toward the fallen tie, her wedding band glinting as it caught the light from the hallway sconces, now flickering uncertainly, as if the house itself was holding its breath, while her husband's free hand hovered above the suitcase's open compartment, where a single photograph lay partially concealed beneath folded shirts, its corner just visible enough to show the edge of a child's swing set, and the blurred motion of small legs kicking toward a summer sky 5 years gone. William's throat moved visibly as he swallowed, the sound loud in the suspended quiet, his fingers now clutching both handkerchiefs in a grip that made the embroidered dates wrinkle against each other, the numbers distorting into something that could have been either 2009 or 2019, depending on how the light struck the twisted threads. While outside, the first raindrops began tapping against the garden doors in a rhythm that almost matched the grandfather clock's slowing ticks. The returned traveler's bad knee gave the slightest audible creak as he shifted his weight, a sound William recognized instantly from nights listening outside the kitchen door when the staff thought him asleep. And in that small, ordinary noise, something unnameable passed between them, settling into the space where all the unanswered questions had piled up like unopened mail, making the air taste suddenly lighter despite the storm-darkened windows, and the teacups' long cold dregs swirling with the remains of a broken silver chain. Mrs. Harrington's extended hand trembled once before steadying, her fingers unfurling to reveal the faint crescent indents left by her own nails during too many solitary breakfasts, while her husband's shadow, still leaning slightly to accommodate the old injury, stretched across the tablecloth in a shape that didn't quite match the man himself, like a suit tailored for someone who no longer existed. William's pocket lining stretched slightly with the weight of 2 handkerchiefs now, their embroidered dates pressing against his thigh through the fabric in a way that made him hyper-aware of his own breathing, too fast for 12, too slow for 7, as the grandfather clock's pendulum hesitated mid-swing, catching on some nearly imperceptible unevenness in the air currents that hadn't been there moments before, leaving the hour hand suspended between 2 numbers like a traveler pausing between train platforms. The teapot's last droplet trembled on the saucer's edge, refracting the light into a prism that briefly painted all 3 faces with the same watery gold before disappearing into the linen, leaving only the scent of bergamot and rain, and the quiet sound of William exhaling through his nose in the exact cadence his father always had when bracing for something difficult, a mannerism so perfectly replicated it made both adults turn toward him with identical expressions of startled recognition. their mirrored movements sending ripples through the charged silence like stones dropped into still water years, apart finally meeting mid-descent. The suitcase latch gave a soft metallic sigh as it settled further open, revealing the photographs hidden half where Mrs. Harrington's hand rested on the swing's rope. Her wedding band, catching that same summer light now, diffused through storm clouds outside, the image trembling slightly as William's father shifted his weight to accommodate his knee. An adjustment so small it barely ruffled the air, yet somehow realigned the room's entire gravity, drawing the loose thread from Mrs. Harrington's collar downward until it brushed the saucer's edge where her brooch chain had lain moments before, connecting broken silver to abandoned tea in a fragile line that might have been coincidence or providence, depending on who was looking. William's fingers tightened around the handkerchiefs, just enough to make the embroidered dates align at right angles. His birthday, perpendicular to his parents' anniversary, forming a temporary intersection where all their separate timelines could theoretically meet if you ignored the 5-year gap between stitchings. While outside, the rain intensified just enough to blur the garden doors into impressionist streaks of green and gray that made the interior seem suddenly sharper by contrast. Every frayed thread and tarnished edge thrown into relief against the muted backdrop like artifacts in a museum exhibit about how families weather absences. The grandfather clock's pendulum, freed from whatever momentary hesitation had stalled it, swung through its next arc with renewed vigor, its weights descending with a soft wooden thump that coincided precisely with Mrs. Harrington's wedding band touching the tablecloth, a barely audible chime that nonetheless seemed to startle the loose thread from her collar into finally detaching. Its slow drift downward interrupted when William's father reached across the suitcase to catch it midair, his fingers pausing just shy of his son's sleeve, as if suddenly uncertain whether such small rescues were still his privilege after so many larger abandonments. The handkerchief in William's pocket shifted slightly as he inhaled the embroidered dates pressing against his thigh in a way that made him abruptly aware of how much taller he stood now than in the photograph's frozen moment. While beyond the rain-streaked windows, the garden's laurel hedge shuddered under a gust that sent droplets skittering across the glass, like hurried footsteps retreating from some uncomfortable truth, their paths intersecting and diverging in patterns that briefly mirrored the tangle of silver chains and broken brooches scattered across the tea tray. Mrs. Harrington's outstretched palm remained suspended above the table, her wedding band now dulled by the stormlight, as her gaze flickered between the photograph's revealed corner and her husband's bad knee. The connection between these two vulnerabilities, passing unspoken through the charged air, like a current strong enough to bridge years of silence, yet too fragile to withstand the weight of direct acknowledgement, leaving them all suspended in this moment, where every gesture seemed simultaneously an offering and a test. The butler's abandoned glove retained its perfect shape on the teapot handle, a phantom presence more palpable now in its absence than it had been during all those years of silent service. While the suitcase's broken latch finally gave way completely, releasing a folded newspaper from some foreign city that slid halfway out onto the floor, its date visible just long enough to confirm it was published the week after William's 10th birthday, before a draft from the hallway sent it skittering beneath the sideboard, where it would likely remain undisturbed until some future spring cleaning uncovered it alongside other artifacts of abandonment too painful to display, yet too precious to discard. William's thumbnail caught on a loose thread in the handkerchief's embroidery, his father's handwriting rendered in silk floss, unraveling just enough of the date's final digit to make it ambiguous whether it read 2009 or 2013. This small uncertainty spreading through him like ink in water as his father's fingers, still hovering near his sleeve, twitched in a motion that could have been reaching to stop the unraveling, or simply adjusting his own cuff, the duality making William exhale sharply through his nose in that same inherited mannerism that seemed to startle them both anew each time it surfaced. Mrs. Harrington's wedding band made another faint chime against the saucer when she finally lowered her palm, not withdrawing the offer so much as acknowledging its suspension. Just as the grandfather clock's minute hand jerked forward to cover the exact moment when her husband's bad knee gave its most audible creak of the afternoon, the sound syncopating oddly with the rain's rhythm against the windows to create a brief cacophony that masked whatever words might have been spoken next, leaving only the echo of 3 separate inhalations held just slightly too long before dissolving into the room's thick silence. The photograph in the suitcase shifted imperceptibly with the draft, revealing for one fraction of a second the shadow of whoever had been holding the camera that day, before settling back into its nest of starched shirts, leaving the 3 of them staring not at the image itself, but at the space just above it, where that unseen presence had briefly superimposed itself over their current tableau. Like a ghostly 4th participant in this reunion, none of them quite knew how to navigate without the butler's silent orchestration, or the grandfather clock's reliable punctuation to mark the spaces between what needed saying and what could remain, for now, folded neatly alongside other half-remembered truths.